Hello everybody, welcome to week 4 of the course. Can't believe it, it's kind of crazy that at the end of the next week we'll actually be a third through the course, so time's flying by. Anyway, I hope your semesters are off to a good start. Hope you enjoyed your Labor Day break. Okay, so an announcement in the beginning. I think some students are still slightly confused about how the whole discussion process works. So each week we have a reading, right? And the way that you find that reading is by going to the syllabus. For instance, for this week, you go to week 4 on the syllabus, and you'll see a reading. You'll see a topic like the rule of law, and you'll see a reading listed next to that. In this case, it's the Crito by Plato is our reading. And what I'm doing is I'm going into, on Canvas, I'm going into our Files tab. Under the files, I've created a folder called Course Readings, and I'm posting readings in there. And last week I put in something Plato Thrasymachus. I apologize, I probably should have put that as Plato Republic, right? So that might have been a bit confusing, but I think that was the only Plato reading in there at the time. So anyway, I apologize for the confusion on that. But from now on, I will label the reading as whatever it's labeled on the syllabus. So this week it's Plato, Crito, right? And the way that it will work is on Wednesday around noon, maybe sometimes it might be sometime Wednesday afternoon, I'm going to post a discussion question. And whenever I post that discussion question, if I post it at noon, you have 24 hours, so Wednesday Thursday at noon to respond to it. If I post it at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, you have 2 o'clock until 2 o'clock on Thursday to respond to it. So 24 hours for the first response. Please respond in your groups. And then you have until Sunday, after you've responded to the initial post, to respond to one of your classmates. Now what I'm typically going to do is probably on Monday sometime, after you have made your initial comments and your classmates have commented on your comments and vice versa, I'll jump in and I'll say, hey, did you consider this? Did you consider that? The reason I'm doing that is waiting until Monday is because I want you guys to try to hash it out between yourselves before I actually come in and sort of say, hey, have you thought about this? This might be the way that it, the reading is typically interpreted. So anyway, look for my comments, and I'm not going to comment on everybody's post, but I'll try to comment on a couple. Especially if there are ones that I think, have a really important point to be made. So go back, Monday, Tuesday. Make sure that you have your notifications turned on to where when I comment on your comments that you get a notification that says, Professor Hodges, responded to your discussion post. But anyway, that's how it works, right? That's how the whole discussion thing works. And I'm going to be posting the video on Tuesday, every Tuesday, just like today. Okay, so enough preliminaries. Let's get to the fun stuff, right? Justice. Justice was sort of the theme of this last week's discussion, last week's readings. And for justice, I had you guys look at two accounts, right? One is from the most famous account of justice, in political theory, the Republic, right? So Plato, and if you guys don't have experience with Plato, all of his writings are contained in dialogues, right? So it's him essentially having a conversation with somebody else. But of course, he's not actually having the conversation in the dialogues, it's Socrates, right? Socrates is sort of Plato's mouthpiece for a lot of these. And there's some debate about, which of these, dialogues is taken directly from the historical Socrates and which ones are the ones where Plato's actually expressing his opinions through Socrates. Generally, people think that some of the earlier dialogues, it was actually the true Socrates. But as Plato started getting later into his writings, he started expressing more of his own opinions through Socrates. So this is the Republic, right? This is Plato's most famous dialogue. And the Republic is all about what is justice, right? So, Socrates, as he often does, goes down to the city center, the town square or whatever, and he's having these interactions with Athenians, merchants, politicians, rhetoricians, etc., etc. And he's talking to his friends Polemarchus and Cleitophon about justice, and Thrasymachus shows up, right? So they're talking about justice, and Thrasymachus shows up, and he, says, Socrates, you're so annoying, and you're always trying to play tricks on people, and he's kind of up in arms about things, and that's when he gives his explanation of what justice is, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then also I had you guys look at the Melian debate, which is taken from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, where the Athenians are having I guess you could call it a negotiation, though it's not much of a negotiation, with the Melians, the people of Melos, about why they should surrender to the Athenians. Okay, so justice. What is justice, right? So when we typically think about justice, we think about somebody maybe getting what they deserve, right? So maybe we say justice is people getting what they deserve. Of course, that begs a question, right? What do people deserve? Right? How do we go about determining what people are actually entitled to? Right? Is it some decree from the gods that says every person is entitled to this? Is it a set of laws that says every person is entitled to this? Or is it sort of the law of the jungle where, and this is the opinion expressed by Thrasymachus and by the Athenians, the strong determine what people deserve, right? The strong take what they want and they deserve it because they're strong, and the weak essentially have to follow along with the strong because they don't have a choice, right? Because the strong can just overthrow them and kill them at their own will, which is essentially what the Athenians were saying to the Melians. We can kill you, so you don't have a choice. That's justice, right? But typically we'd like to think that justice is a concept that it has some sort of moral dimension to it, right? Something that goes beyond this notion of, well, I just do what I want because I'm the strongest. And we would like to believe that, people are entitled to certain types of treatment, right? Bill of Rights, for instance, in our case, right? But what Thrasymachus is about, and what the Athenians were about, was something I guess you could call a deconstruction of this concept that justice is some sort of higher moral concept that people, have a right to, outside of, who's the strongest, right? And Thrasymachus and the Athenians are just saying, no, that's not the case, right? There is no universal concept of what justice is and the way that somebody should be treated when you're asking if they're going to be treated justly. So that leads to another question, right? And the important question is two important questions. First, who decides what counts as justice, right? Because we're talking, especially in a political theory course versus maybe a moral theory course, we're talking about justice within a particular political body, right? So within the United States, what does justice look like in the United States? Who decides what justice looks like in the United States, right? So what is justice, at least politically speaking, in the United States? Well, justice in the United States has to do with whether people are treated in accordance with the laws that govern our society, right? So in our society, what determines what is just are the laws, right? It's the Constitution, state laws, local laws. We live in a rule of law, right? We're talking about rule of law this week. So the laws determine in our society what is just and what is unjust. Maybe in a dictatorship, right? Maybe like North Korea, for example. I think somebody mentioned North Korea in one of the discussions. In North Korea, what is just, if you're using this purely deconstructed view of justice that doesn't have any sort of moral content to it, then justice is determined by what the dictator decrees. Right? So what is justice? What Kim Jong-un, right, says is just. But of course that, that begs the larger question of, can justice be applied outside of particular political context, right? So we can say what justice looks like in the United States for us because we have a system of laws that that constitute our society. But what does justice look like on an international level, right? What does it look like on a global scale, right? Is there a way to transcend? Because, certainly we don't want to believe that what's going on in North Korea is just, right? Because that doesn't live up to our conceptions of what justice actually is, right? So is there some sort of universal standard of what justice actually means that goes beyond the different, cultural or political conceptions that different states have, right? And if that were the case, how do we determine it, right? How do we determine what those universal standards of justice actually look like? And that's something that we're very interested in now with the International Criminal Court and the UN and things like that, as our society is becoming more and more sort of intertwined. And essentially, I mean, so Thrasymachus is talking about on an individual level, at least in the beginning, right? Sort of this is what justice looks like. The strong do what's good for them. Right, that's justice, and the weak have to obey. The Athenians are talking about it on an international level, right? They're saying, okay, same deal applies, right? Just as the weak individuals have to follow what the strong individuals want, the weak countries have to follow what the strong countries want. In international political theory, this is something that's known as the school of realism, right? Realism just says that resources and things like that on an international level are limited, right? And each state is going to try to do whatever is in its best interest, right? Which makes sense. Therefore, the strongest states are going to take what benefits them the most because resources are limited. That's just the way it is. And that's essentially the argument that Thrasymachus was making and the Athenians were making in the Melian debate. Yeah, something else I wanted to talk about was a couple of people mentioned this in discussion, this notion of and I even mentioned it with North Korea, right? That you think about dictators, right, or tyranny. The person in charge just does what's best for them, right? Well, but you have to keep in mind that what Thrasymachus is talking about, and he mentions this very explicitly in the beginning, he's not talking about just tyrannies. Right? He's also talking about democracies. He's talking about oligarchies, right? Whoever is in power, whoever has legitimate power in that society, decides what is just and what is unjust. So I guess the question is, us being, good followers of democratic theory, do we believe that what the just thing to do in a democratic society is what the strong, who in a democracy should be the majority of the people, right? Do we believe that what the just thing to do in a democratic society is what the majority of the people want to do? It seems to make sense, right? That seems very logical. But there's a problem there, right? Because consider this particular thought experiment, right? Let's say we live in a democratic society where the majority of people have brown eyes, right? So because we're living in a democratic society, because the brown-eyed people are the majority and they get to determine what's just and what's unjust, they decide that they're going to take all blue-eyed people and all green-eyed people and enslave them and have them, work for the brown-eyed people's benefits. Is that justice, right? Now, it may be, if you're going along the lines of whoever's in power makes the rules that benefit them as your concept of justice, then yeah, that meets that criteria. But the question is, why are we unsatisfied, and why do we have sort of an initial disgust with that particular, if we do, some people may not, if we do, with that particular conception of justice? Because it doesn't seem just to us, right? So I think I talked about John Rawls a little bit before. John Rawls actually had a slightly different understanding of justice, and this is typically what I think most of us think about when we think about justice. And for Rawls, justice was just fairness, right? That people were treated equally and fairly under the system of laws that were put into place, right? So going back to his whole original position and veil of ignorance thing. So for Rawls, justice is fairness. For Thrasymachus and the Athenians, justice is sort of the strong survive, right? Let's see, what else? Yeah, that's another really interesting question, right? So if what is just in a society is not chosen by the strong, by the people who rule in that society, who should it be chosen by, right? That's food for thought, right? So if the people that are in legitimate power, whether it be a dictator, whether it be a council, whether it be a democracy, if they don't choose, then who does, right? And perhaps the answer to that is the reading that we're going to be looking into this week. So I think that's pretty much it for this week. A couple of other things to mention. One, sort of the objections that Socrates had to Thrasymachus, right? The first was that, so Thrasymachus says that what is just, right, is for the rulers to do what is good for them, and for the weak to follow those orders, right? Socrates replies, well, is it the case that rulers make mistakes? Right? Are they fallible? Right? And Thrasymachus assents to that and says, yes, they are. So Socrates argues, well, what if they actually make a decree that's not good for them? Right? So then it would be just for the weak to do something that does not benefit the ruler. Right? So that was one sort of retort that Socrates had to Thrasymachus. Of course, Thrasymachus responded by saying, well, in a matter of fact, people with this great body of knowledge and these great skills actually don't make mistakes, right? So he kind of retreated on his earlier position. And that's when Socrates brings up sort of this famous retort, right, of the purpose of an art or skill, such as he talks about being a sailor, being a horseman, being a politician, is not derived, in fact, to benefit that particular body of knowledge, but it's derived to benefit other people, the weak. Right? So the purpose of medicine is not to make the doctor better. It's not what's best for the doctor in itself. The purpose of medicine is to heal the sick. Right? And Socrates says it's the same thing for politicians and for rulers. The ruler's job is to make sure that the weak are actually being treated fairly. Right? And that's kind of what justice is. So also, we're not reading the entire Republic. Unfortunately, it's awesome if you guys haven't read it. But the entire book is dedicated to laying out what justice actually is. And the fact that, most of Socrates' dialogues are maybe 20, 30, 40 pages, maybe, long ones. But the Republic is, several hundred pages long, right? So this should tell you how complicated this notion of justice actually is to try to sort of flesh out, right? And it is the case often in the dialogues that Plato doesn't really specify what courage is, or what wisdom is, right? But in the Republic, he does provide a very clear account of what justice actually is. And the way that he goes about doing that is he discusses a city, right? And he wants to show the way that a city is operating, right? And everything's operating in its, in its rightful place, right? So according to, this is sort of an ideal or utopian society in a way, right? According to Plato or Socrates' utopian society, you have the famous philosopher king at the top, right? This person who's very rational and makes all these sort of decisions, through philosophical reflection. You have guardians, right? The ones who guard, who are both the soldiers and sort of the politicians that, whether it's a higher order or lower order guardian, the ones that are sort of responsible for protecting the city. And you have the artisans, right? They're the ones who make the things, right? And, for Socrates, justice in the city meant that people who have the certain temperament to be a guardian are guardians. The person who is most qualified to be the ruler is the ruler, right? And the people who are great at being craftsmen are craftsmen. So everything's operating in the right place. It's a type of harmony, right? For Socrates or Plato, justice is a type of harmony, right? So he sets up this account of this perfect city to demonstrate kind of what justice actually looks like. And then he goes on to try to describe how that actually looks in people, right? And Socrates says that there are sort of three elements to a person's spirit or a person's personality. And what justice looks like in the individual is when all three of these parts are operating in harmony, right? So it's a type of balance almost. You could call it justice balance. You could call it, on the Platonic account, it's balance, it's harmony, right? Things are operating as they should, which interestingly, although we tend to put this sort of moral weight pretty often with justice, it's not entirely clear that that's what Plato or Socrates are doing, right? I mean, of course, that perhaps there is a moral dimension to it, but rather than saying, justice is somebody getting what they deserve, which I suppose is similar to this notion of harmony or balance, right? But it's not clear that harmony and balance have the same moral content that we often think about when we think about justice and morality. So anyway, really interesting stuff. I thought you guys did a good job on the discussion. This week we're going to be reading another dialogue, or pieces of a dialogue from Plato. It's from the Crito, and it's Socrates essentially on the day before he's supposed to be executed, and his friend Crito comes to try to break him out, and Plato gives this argument as to why he's better off actually letting the state kill him than trying to escape. Right? And he's talking about several important concepts. He's talking about justice. He's talking